Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Fast Track for Dynamics 365 Tech Talk Solution Development Customization. My name is Kuntal Ghoshal, and I work as a Senior Solution Architect with Fast Track for Dynamics 365 Customer Engagement, Apps, and Common Data Services team. So today we will be talking about customizations, business rule, and best practices around developing a customization, which is a basic when you are adopting or when you are creating customization for your organization. We are expecting to complete it around 1.5 hours. And after this tech talk, the outcome will be you will be learned to how to customize Dynamics 365 using out of the box feature, as well as review the best practices when developing key customizations like solutions with Dynamics 365. So let's begin the TikTok. We will start with customizations in the TikTok. When we talk about Dynamics 365 customization, the first thing that we want to talk about is solution. Now, the key concept of solution is it's a container for customization. So when you are about to transport your apps and components from one organizations to another organizations, basically solution is the only way that Dynamics 365 provides to export your customizations from source organization and import it in the target organization. The solution can contain one or more apps, as well as the components such as sitemaps, entities, processes, web resources, option sets, and many more. You can typically get a solution from app source, which is created by some other organization or individual software vendor provider or ISV, or you can even create your own solution for containing your own customizations that you are developing for your organization need. When you start working with Dynamics 365, there is a default solution as well, which contain all the out of the box key component around that. But it is always recommended when you start customizing your platform, do not use the default solution, rather create your own solution. And we'll talk more about that in the coming slides. There is another key point that I want to mention around when you are exporting the solution and transporting it to your different environment. Like you are doing your development in your dev environment, but you want to move to your customization to your test, your UAT or your SIT or your production environment. You can export the solution as a managed solution or an unmanaged solution and import it to all other environment as a managed or unmanaged solution. From Microsoft point of view, we always recommend only your dev environment should have an unmanaged solution. All other environments should have a managed solution. The scope of this tech talk, we are not going to cover in detail around managed and unmanaged solution. We also have another tech talk published around application lifecycle management. I would highly recommend that you go through that tech talk to understand the best practices and recommendation around managed and unmanaged solution. Moving on, solution properties. So as you can see, this is the when you try developing a solution, this is what you will be getting as a screen from where you will be creating the solution. You can see here I have a display name here, which actually uniquely identify your solution, and there is a name which is basically the schema name or the name that we will be using your solution to store in the database. There is a prefix part of a solution component. So the reason your prefix part is there is any component that's been created as part of your solution that you are creating will have this prefix value. There is a prefix value comes with the default publisher, which is default publisher for your organization. But we always recommend that, sorry, there is a prefix value that comes as new, when you are creating a solution, but we always recommend that you basically create a prefix with a more meaningful name. You can always see that your solution properties also have the contact details, which actually talks about who is creating that solution, more details around that. Some of the other component of the solution is also the publisher. So publisher is actually uniquely identify who is creating that solution, and your organization has a default publisher, which I was talking about earlier. This publisher is basically, if you are not creating a new publisher for your solution, you have a publisher which says default publisher for your organization, but we always recommend that you create a publisher for your organization. There are a couple of other things. Version. So version is basically as you go through multiple incremental deployment to different environment, or you build additional component on your solution. Your version is basically uniquely identifying what are the additional things that you are building, basically recognizing the different development that you are putting on top of your solution. The version has four component, like four different digit, as you can see, and each of it typically talks about, if you're coming from a development background, we always talk about major, minor, build, revision. So if your solution does include a major customization element, or let's say your solution is sprint dependent, sprint one solution, sprint two solution, then definitely your major version name should be changing. Also, the minor version name can include the different component changes, and accordingly build and revision gets priority. There are no hard and fast rule on how you want to version your solution. Rather, it's typically dependent on your organization development standard. There are prefix value for the option set as well. So option set automatically gets a prefix value. Make sure that you also change it to some meaningful option set prefix value based on your standard. Moving on, let's talk about solution component. So solution components are basically represents all the components that are included in a solution and potentially you can customize. So anything that can be included in a solution component, we can basically tag it as a part of that solution. Typically, most of the solution components are nested within other solution component. Just for an example, an entity contains forms, views, charts, field, relationship, the messages, typically business rule. Each of the solution component requires an entity to exist, and those solution component will be nested with that entity. The purpose of having a solution component is also to keep track of any limitations on what can be customized using the managed properties and all solution dependencies. So when you export a solution as a managed solution, you can also mark what are the components you want your target environment to customize, and accordingly you can mark the customizable property of those component as true. Now, some of the solution components here, as you can see, we largely categorically put it as schema, user interface, template, miscellaneous, which actually is a box containing multiple different component, and we have processes or steps of code. So let's talk a little bit. I'm not going to explain much detail because we will be talking about most of the things in the coming slide. But schema are basically entities that you will be creating or you will be including as part of your customization. The fields, the relationship, user interface are basically forms, views, charts, dashboard, sitemap, ribbon, and then there are templates, which you might create for your organizational need, like email template or KV article template, mail march template. There are processes or steps or code that you also can include as a part of solution, like workflows or dialogue, which is again deprecated, and business process flow, your custom action, web resources. If you're creating a plugin assembly, which definitely contain custom .NET code, SDK messages, those all can be included as a part of your solution. Also in the miscellaneous box, we had got security role, your field security profile, which is basically providing additional minute control on a field on a field, so that you can decide which user can access that particular field or which role can access that particular field on top of the security role. Connection role, reports, solution publisher, some of the new feature like Power Automate or Flow, and Canvas app. So these are all the components that can be included as a part of your solution. There are different approaches that you can adopt to do a customization. So customization, there are typical ways that can be adopted to do customizations. Like you can go to settings, solution, or settings, customization, and open your solution, or even you can adopt the new Maker portal on top of Classic portal to do your customization. Just to remember that some of the capabilities that we are releasing might not be available in the Classic portal as well. And from a recommendation perspective, we always recommend our customers and users to leverage the Maker portal, which is the newer interface of customizing Dynamics 365. You can always access the Maker portal by typing make.powerapps.com. And from we started deploying on some of the region, you can also get the Maker portal when you start customizing a solution. Let's talk about some of the key components that we earlier talked as a part of the solution. We'll start with an entity. So entity is basically like a database table. So when you start leveraging the Dynamics 365, you get some of the entities that the platform provides you, like account, case, lead, business unit. These are nothing but the tables where whatever your organization data that will be created in the platform will be stored. There are so when we talk about an entity, definitely there are different type of entity which we'll be covering on the next slide, and then the ownership of entity, who will be owning that entity. An entity can be owned by the team or an organization. Organization is basically everyone in the organization will have an access to that entity, depending on again the role that will be provisioned, and user or team-owned entity have a much strict access policy in terms of the organization. The field that actually inside the entity we also call attribute from a developer term is nothing but the column on the database table. So if you denote entity as a database table, a field is basically a column on that database table. The field have multiple data type, which we'll be talking in the coming slide in detail. Let's talk about the form. So in Dynamics 365, the forms provides the user interface that your end user or organization will be used to interact with the data that they need on their daily work. A form basically contain fields, which is the attribute which are part of the entity, the subgrid, or a lot of other component that you can include as a part of the form, like PCF control can be also included as a part of the form, which we'll talk a little bit in the coming slides. It can also have client-side scripting and features like a business process flow or business rule, which defines how your data will be displayed. Additional rule on that particular data or the field, like if some of the field's value is A, then do not display some of the other fields. So all those rules and types that you can control using client-side scripting or business process. Let's talk about a view. In Dynamics 365, views basically display a type of or view displays the list of record, and we'll talk more about views. But typically, when you have an entity configured, a view is basically displaying the detail of that entity, and you can also have a filter criteria to define what are the records that you want to be displayed as a part of that view. Let's talk about types of entity. So there are typically two types of entities. One is the system entity, which is nothing but when you have a platform, then when you configure a platform, some of the entities that we talked about earlier comes as a part of the platform. And these are built-in entities like account, contact, lead. Some of these entities you can modify as part of your customization, like account entity. If you are using in your solution, you can add field, you can add multiple different forms. You can basically make that entity more usable for your organization. Some of the entities you cannot modify. You cannot delete system entities, and you cannot lock down a system entity. Lockdown means you cannot basically mark it as not editable by a managed solution. Custom entities, on the other hand, it's basically if your organization needs a custom behavior that's not achievable through a system entity. In those scenarios, you basically create a custom entity. And custom entities, when you are creating as a part of recommendation or best practices perspective, it should be created from your own solution, not a part of your default solution, so that it can have the prefix and the publisher that you already classified. The custom entities you can modify, you can edit based on your particular organization need. It can be included as a part of your solution. And again, as we discussed earlier, you can also mark those custom entities as non-editable or editable if you are exporting them as a managed solution through managed properties. So this is a pictorial representation of the new Maker portal when you are creating an entity. And as you can see here, this is the entity that's been created here as Contour first. As the entity, it has got a schema name, which is the name which gets stored in the database table, which is basically a table name, and then there is a display name. Also, there are different advanced settings inside the entity, like why this entity has been created, the type, and the ownership of that entity. And then there are a bunch of other settings, in what will happen for during create or update of that entity. And there are also settings mentioning if that entity will be available in Outlook. On the other hand, we talk about attribute, which is nothing but a column on that entity table. So this is another representation of a column or field being created. So the same thing you can also see here. There is this display name, which is the name that's been displayed on the form. We have a schema name, which is how this particular field will be stored in the database. We have data type, which actually define how that particular column in the database, what sort of data it can store. We also have a couple of other parameters here, like whether this particular field will be searchable in the advanced find, if it is a required field or not, what is the description, and the other behavioral properties associated with that data type. When you create a field, you can see here, these are some of the, so this is the first field that we just created, and these are some of the fields that gets created when you create a custom entity. Some of those fields the platform creates for you so that it can better track and manage what are the operations being performed in that particular entity. Just to name a few of those fields, created by, created by determines who had created a particular record inside that entity. Created on is when that particular record is been created, who had modified, when it is modified, who is owning that particular record. Is it owned by a business unit or by a team or by a particular user? What is the status of that particular record, whether it is an active record, it's an inactive record, what is the status reason, the time zone. All these fields actually gets created. Also the primary field, which actually determines that particular record or entity. Um, those are the fields that gets created when you create an entity by the platform itself. Let's talk about publishing. So when we create customization in a solution or even in the default solution, those customization or changes are not available unless it's been published. So publishing is basically making sure that whatever changes are being made on the platform, those changes are taken effect from from the platform perspective and will be available to your organization, to all the users who are using those particular changes. So the publish is basically you can do the publish for the whole entity or for a selective set of entities. There is no way that publishing can be done on a piecemeal approach. So basically, when you select a publish for an entity or for a solution, all components which are part of that particular entity or solution, like field, form, views, chart, business rule, they all get published, and any changes that you are making as part of the solution will be available. So this is again on the Maker portal, how the publishing is performed. So you can see here, once you select a solution, you can see that you can partially publish that solution, or even you can publish all customization, which will publish any customization that's been performed by any developer or any system administrator inside your organization. Just from a best practices perspective, when you are publishing a customization, it is always recommended that you only publish the solution that you are making changes. If you are publishing the all customizations, all the solutions, there are chances that some users or some other system administrator who are making changes and do not want those changes to be available. If you make a publish all customization, all those changes will be available even if they are not completed. Moving on, let's talk about the field definition. So the field is again a column that's been created in your entity table inside the database. A field can have different data type. So in our previous example, we have seen that the text as a data type, but it can also have multiple different data type, and it appears as a control on the form. These fields are basically where your end users will be interacting on a form, entering data or creating, updating, modifying the data. They are also used as a display column inside a view. Um, in a query as well. In when you are making a query, when you are making a retrieve request, even through an API or even from outside Dynamics, you are basically retrieving the query. And this is again, as we already discussed, basically a column inside your SQL database. So these are the different field types that's available with Dynamics, and we'll not go through each one of them. Just on a very high level, some of the field types are a single line of text, which basically can hold up to 4,000 character. We also get multiple line of text where it also behave to allow users to enter text, but the limit of that is a much higher, 1048576 text character. That's the max limit. We can have option set, which is a drop down. We can have two options, which is nothing but a bit. You can have only two options as a part of your option set. You can have image, whole number, floating point number, decimal, currency, multiple line of text, date and time, lookup as a common field type. So when you are creating a field inside an entity, you have a wide range of choices of what sort of field type you want to create. There is a new field type that's been introduced with Dynamics 365, which is a file type. So when you create a file type, even though it is not exposed as of now, but it basically inside it creates a blob reference and store the file information inside the blob reference. So this is again on the Maker portal. When you are creating a field, these are some of the field type that you can choose, and you can see here the field type also has a component like text. You can choose to have either text or text area, email, URL, and similarly for whole number, date and time, file. So each field type has again got a different way of allowing you to enter the data. Just for an example, even if you choose a field to be a date time, you can also choose the type of that particular field as a date only, where the user doesn't cannot be or not be able to select the time. Similarly, when you are choosing a text field, you can choose to be an email or a URL on that type of the field, and on the UI, when that control or the field is displayed on the form, it will be having those default validation already implemented from a platform perspective. So email will automatically come with a validation, same as a phone number, where you cannot enter anything other than a phone number, or similarly for an email. Option set or two option set. So option set are basically it stores like a field that gets displayed as a drop down on the form, and it has got two components. One is the display component, and another one is the associated numeric value, which you can see when you are creating an option set. It stores the option set values as an integer, and there are also a default value that you can provide as part of the option set. You can also have, when you're creating an option set, you can also choose that option set cannot be entered by the user as well. Like not marking is as a default value should always be there, or marking it as mandatory on the form. The two option set can be a Boolean value like yes, no, as an example. On the form, when it gets displayed, it only provides user to choose any one of those two values. Numeric field. This is very interesting, as it also have a lot of the different properties like maximum and minimum value to talk about. When you are choosing a numeric field, you can provide for an end user perspective, what is the maximum value that they can enter. There are different precision property for a numeric field, like it can be for a floating point number 0 to 5, for a decimal 0 to 10, for a currency 0 to 4 decimal places. Now, talking about numeric, there is a very interesting concept. When to choose a decimal or when to choose a floating point number. So basically, floating decimal numbers are basically stores in the database exactly as it's been specified from the user interface or from the forms, whereas floating point numbers are being stored in the database as an extremely close approximation of the value. So when you do not need a very precise number, you should always use a floating point number which stores an approximation instead of using a decimal. But if you need an exact number, how it is entered in the UI, you need an exact number like that. You should always choose decimal. Now, where is the difference is on the performance. So decimal, as it is very precise numbers that been stored in the database. It's the performance of decimal is conceptually should be slower than a floating point number, but that performance difference might not even be visible from an end user perspective. So from a whole number, these are the display format of a whole number. If you choose none, then it's displayed as it's entered as an integer value. You can also choose the duration, which is a number of minutes, and the maximum is around 3 days. You can also choose the display format as a time zone, and in that case, the time zone will be displayed as a standard dropdown. You can also choose language as a display format, and in that case, the language is basically displayed in the control. Like for English, it will be 1033, 1036 is for French. Now, coming back to the different field type, date and time, it's one of the very important data type to understand how it's been stored inside the database and when to use what. So when you are creating a date and time data type, it gives you three different choices. Namely user local, which is very new in Dynamics 365. There is a date only, and user local is the behavior that's existed even the previous version. There is date only, and there is the new one, which is time zone independent. So user local is basically you are creating, you want the date time to be displayed based on the user's local or browser settings in terms of time zone. So the date time will be stored in UTC, and depending on users from which region or country or time zone he's accessing, it will be basically displaying according to that time zone. You can also choose as a date only. In that case, only users from a user's point of view, it will only be providing a date only option. But from a database point of view, it will still be storing 12 a.m. as a time. You can also choose a time zone independent in that particular type. Doesn't matter which region the user is accessing that particular date time field, but if it is marked as a time zone independent, whatever is entered from a UI, that will be displayed on the user's front. So I'm, for an example, I'm based out in Sydney, and I'm entering data on a date time on a time zone independent field. But even if it's been accessed from New York, he or she will still be, the user will still be seeing the Sydney time because the field is time zone independent. Lookup fields are basically the holds the relationship from one entity to another entity. So when you create a relationship between two entities, it also creates a lookup, and it's been stored as a globally unique identifier as a GUID. So when you create a lookups, typically it's been associated with a one-to-n relationships. You can also create end-to-end relationship as well, but internally the system or the platform interprets it as one-to-n and n-to-one relationship. We will talk more about lookup in the coming slide, but a couple of additional property to know for lookup. When you are configuring a lookup field, you can choose whether you want a related record filtering, like depending on whether you want a related record filtering on that lookup or not. You can turn this switch, you can turn this field on and off from a customization perspective. You can also choose to have a display the search box, or the search box will not be visible on the lookup control in the field. Moving on, we'll be talking about some of the field requirements. So when you create a field inside Dynamics, you can mark that field as optional or business recommended or business required. So what that means is when you are marking those a field as an optional or a business required field, it's basically when you are putting that particular field or control on the form, it will behave in that way. If you mark a field as optional, when the user is creating a record, he can choose not to put any data on against that field. Rather, if you are marking it as a business required field, the user actually have to enter or provide a value against that field if he wants to save the form. It can also be modified by using a business rule or JavaScript, this field requirement part. And one thing to understand that it's only enforced on form. There are some other field properties like searchable. It we talked about it earlier as well. It basically determines if that particular field will be searchable in the advanced find queries. When you trigger an advanced find queries, if you want to see that particular field, you need to mark that checkbox as searchable. Field security is nothing but determine whether you need additional granular security to be provided based on a very specific set of users inside your organization. Auditing is kind of keeping a track of what changes has been done on that particular field, who made those changes, what time it's been changed, and then description is again why this field's been created. We'll talk about some of the form types. So if you are following this Tech Talk, we talk about form types. Their form is basically how the data will be represented to the end user. And there are typically different type of forms that exist against an entity. When you create an entity, the platform also creates some of the default form types, a different type of forms for that entity. So main form is basically the form um, that will be rendered in browser, Outlook, or tablet or Dynamics 365 web. which is again the browser. Quick create is basically the shortened version. So if you are creating a related record from a primary record, you can leverage the quick create, where you are only marking some of the fields which are absolutely required for creating that particular entity. Quick view is basically a read-only view of the parent record displayed in a related record. And then again, the card form, which is basically used in the views for unified interface apps. And card forms are basically defined or designed to present a very compact format information in the mobile devices. Now you can also, when you are defining different form types, you can also choose what form types to be marked as a default form type when the entity form loads. You can also mark them against a particular role. Let's talk about structure of a form. So when you are creating or when you are using a form, there are different sections inside the form. Header, which is the top section of the form, footer, which is the bottom section of the form, and then the body where actually all the different control or fields are being displayed. So we'll talk a little bit around each of these area. So header is basically the topmost section of the form where you want the most key information to be displayed. Now, there are two different type of header that you can configure. One is high density form header and another one is low density form header. When you are using a high density form header, the advantage of it is the record title never truncate. Even for a really long title, it's being displayed in multiple lines, even if you change the resolution. Similarly, it's always visible, the high density header, and the information is basically displayed as read only. From a low density point of view, that allows user to directly edit the field values on the header. It also allows visualizations such as custom component, web resources you can put as part of the header. And one of the disadvantage is again, the key information can be truncated if you're using a low density header. In the body, where in the body of the form where you are actually displaying all the control, basically it goes as a tab, and inside the tab you have different section, and in the section you put your different control or fields in the form. So the tab can have multiple column, can have 1 to 3 column, and it you depending on what type of tab you are choosing, you basically put section inside those tabs. From a best practices recommendation perspective, if you have a lot of information that needs to be displayed in a form, always use different tabs. The reason behind these, the tabs can get loaded on the form asynchronously, which can improve the performance of the form load time. So the section, again, the section column can contain the fields, which are basically the attribute or the column, the subgrid, the nodes control, iframe, web resources, Bing map, if you are using a PCF control, all of these can be a part of your section in the form. So let's talk a little bit around the structure of a form. So when you are creating the structure of a form and putting different field on the form, you can also choose what will be the display type or input for those particular field. And Dynamics 365, depending on the type of the field, provides you multiple different ways to create or to display those input. Like if it is for whole number, currency, floating point, decimal, you can use linear gauge, number input, linear slider, arc knob, radial knob. And if it is a Boolean or two input option, you can choose to use flip switch. So this is the again, on the Maker portal, all the input that's been displayed here. We are also displaying, you can see here, this is a form, and inside the form, I have got multiple different fields that's been displayed inside a section, which is again inside a general tab. In the layout, you can choose to have a 1 column, 2 column, or 3 column tab, and inside a tab, you can choose to have section which can have 1, 2, 3, or 4 column. Let's talk a little bit around Form Designer. So this is the form designer, which has got multiple different sections. The command bar, which is on the top, which displays all available actions such as save, publish, undo, redo. This section, the left-hand section, actually have got the pane, which displays multiple different function like field pane, which is basically which fields you need to put on the form. Then it has also got component pane to add components. Also got tree view to see the hierarchy of component. There is a form preview, which is basically allows you to display the real-time preview of the form. And again, the property pane, which is depending on what field or where exactly you are, which area you want to see the property, and this section gets populated with the property. There is a preview side switcher, which actually help you to determine or define the resolution against which you want to do the preview. There is a zoom slider, which is zoom in or zoom out the form preview, helping you to take a closer look. And there is a fit to width button, which basically fit the form preview with the available width. Moving on, subgrid. So subgrid displays data from other records in the form. So let's say I am on an entity called account, and I want to display a related entity record contact in my account form. Now, account and contact can have 1 to n relationship. One account can have multiple contact, and I can use a subgrid to basically display all the contacts which are related with that particular account inside a subgrid in my form. Usually we display a related record, but there can be situation or scenarios where you want to display unrelated records as well. You need to choose when you are defining a subgrid, you need to choose a particular view or a filter criteria, depending on which you want to display those subgrid. And then you also need to choose the data, what format you want to show the data, whether as a list or as a chart, but you cannot have both at the same time. Moving on, relationship. So entity relationship defines how records can be related to each other in the database. In the simplest level, adding a lookup field to an entity creates a new one-to-many relationship between these two entities and let you put a lookup field on the form. With a particular lookup field, your users can associate multiple child record of that entity in a single parent-child kind of a scenario. There are different relationship type. It can be 1 to n or n to 1. But n to 1 is just a representation of the relationship. Actually, the relationship is 1 to n. And there can be a self-referencing relationship. For example, a case, subcase, or a parent-child account. So as I was explaining around the relationship, one-to-end relationship is basically again displayed as one to n to one on the related record perspective, but it doesn't really exist on the metadata. When you create a particular relationship, it also create the particular metadata in the database, which actually represent that particular relationship. For example, when you create account to contact as a relationship, there is also a particular metadata that gets created in the database to determine that parent to child relationship. Just to mention here, there are some relationships which actually created by system. And even when you are creating a custom entity, some of the relationships are actually created by platform. For example, with your custom entity, system user entity relationship, which actually determines or which actually stores which user is creating the record or which user is modifying the record. So this is on the Maker portal, creating a relationship. So as you can see here, I have a custom entity, Contoshow, which is my prefix of the solution publisher, and Contoshow underscore vendor name. I'm creating it as a lookup, as a relationship with a related entity as account. And this is the actual metadata that gets stored in the database, which determine the relationship, the parent-child relationship between these two entities. And it also have a description field, which actually is useful for the developer to understand why this particular relationship or lookups been created. So when you create or choose a lookup on the Maker portal and provide all the required detail, it also asks you to provide whether this lookup will be required or not, and whether it will be searchable on the advanced find or not. So when you create it, the next screen that comes up is this, where it basically this platform asks you to provide additional advanced settings. As you can see here, entity and account to this vendor is having a 1 to n relationship, and the lookup field name is contest underscore vendor name. And there is this type of behavior which actually talks about what will happen if the parent entity gets deleted, or there are some action that's been performed on the parent entity, what will happen on the child entity. Apologies, just to mention a couple of other things. This particular section, like delete, assign, share, this section actually talks about what are the different behavior that will happen when these particular actions are performed on the primary entity. So like one-to-one relationship behavior, some of the cascading rules like control, these cascading rules controls actions on the primary record that are also performed on the related entity records. So when you perform something on the parent record, what will happen to the child record. It also makes sure that there are no orphan record in the platform. So when you are creating a parent record, a child record, you might want to delete that child record when you are basically deleting that parent record. Some of the action that triggered this one-to-n cascading behavior. So these are some of the action: assign, when the primary entity record is reassigned; share, when the primary entity record is shared; unshare, reparent, when the primary entity record like a parent account is child account is reparented; merge, when primary entity record is merged with another record; delete, when a primary entity record is deleted; roll-up view, what is the desired behavior when the roll-up view associated with that relationships. So these are the cascading rules that gets applied during assign, share, or reparent type of action. So cascade all, which is basically performing this action to all related entity records. Cascade active, which is whatever action is being performed on the parent record, only perform those action on the related child record. Cascade user owned, which is whatever is being performed, the action being performed on the parent record, only performed those action to the child record if it is owned by the user who is performing that action. And there is this cascade none, where related entity record is not affected at all. When there is this, when you are deleting, this is the cascading rules that gets applied. Cascade all, which basically delete all the related entity records. Remove link, where the link between the parent and the related record is basically removed. So this particular behavior also can create orphan record. Let's say your account, your contact has got a parent account. So when you are deleting that parent account, you might choose to delete that contact record, the child contact, which is cascade all. You might also choose to just remove the link without deleting the contact record. And in that particular case, the remove link will create an orphan contact record without a parent record. Restrict delete, where related entities are not affected at all, and this rule prevents the primary entity record from being deleted. So as an example, your primary account can have multiple child contact. So if there is a restrict delete, unless all those child contacts are deleted, you cannot be able to delete the primary account record. And these also prevent orphan records getting created on the platform. So these are some of the type of cascading behavior. If it is parental, all rules, the cascade rules applied as all rules to cascade all. If it is referential, the rules that get applied are main rules are cascade none. For delete, it is remove link. For referential, restrict delete. For main rules, it is cascade none. For delete, it is restrict delete. If it is custom or configurable cascading, the rules that get applied is all rules cascade all by default. But again, you can configure on each of those particular action what rule you want to be applying. Let's talk about view customization. So views are basically based on the filter or the where clause that you are defining from the customization, the record set that gets displayed to the end user. When you are configuring a view, the detail of that views gets stored in the system in a form of fetch XML. There are some clause as dynamic or relative, such as equal current user or last 3 months, which are like dynamic clause. Even if you are creating a filtered view, even you are creating a view, the filter criteria can be dynamic based on logged in user or based on current users. And there are, when you are creating views, you can also specify what are the field or column that will be displayed on that particular view. You can also define the priority of those column, like you can define the display property, what is the size of those field that will be displayed on the view. You can also create a sorting order based on like up to 2 column, and based on that your view will be sorted. There are some system views that gets created already existing, and when you are creating an entity, there are some views for that custom entities which already gets created by the platform. and you can always create another view that is typically required by your organization. You can create a view only for your own use, or you can create a view for the entire organization. You can also create a view and share that particular view within a specific set of user or group or team within your organization. When you create a view, these views are always displayed in alphabetical order. So all the views will come in alphabetical order, and then there are, from a best practice recommendation perspective, when you are creating a view, we always recommend that use save as functionality and use an existing view. So what that means is, unless you are creating a brand new view, if you're using an existing view, it also saves a lot of time to bring some of the common fields that's been used in that view. View also, to be make it more faster, remove the column that are not intended to be used within the view, and your view should only display the column that are required for those set of user. For example, you can create a view like show me all the customers where there is no transactions done in last 3 months. So in this particular view, you can only choose to display the customer detail, the transaction, the customer detail, and their account exec detail, the reason why there is no transaction, stuff like that. Rather than, you can also have a view which shows all active customer, where you get all detailed information like customer first name, last name, address, phone, their account executive, and their related status and all detail, which might not be required for a more specific view. So let's talk about a little bit around charts. And this is chart is again another way. Charts and dashboard is another way to basically display the information to your user. Inside an organization, you can also default when a user login with chart or dashboard, he will be having an access. So we will talk about the some of the key differences of a chart, the chart, system chart, and personal chart. So system charts are created by system customizer. Personal chart any user can create based on his individual need. Um, the system chart is a part of the solution so that it is available for the entire organization, whereas personal chart not included in a solution. System chart can be included in a system or personal dashboard. Personal chat can be included in a personal dashboard only, but it cannot be included in a system dashboard because it is not a part of the entire organization deployment. The system chart is available to all users, whereas personal chart is only available to a selective users or teams. Um, Whereas the export part is concerned, you can always export both this type as a chart XML file. This is an example of charts and dashboard. As you can see here, this is showing sales activity dashboard, and there are multiple different charts that's been displayed here. You can choose what format you want to show the chart. You can choose what views are required or can be configured to show that chart. And from a user perspective, you can define what dashboard they will have access when your users are logging into Dynamics 365 platform. There are some of the dashboards that comes default with the platform. So when you are configuring a Dynamics 365, there are some of the dashboards depending on what first party app you are using, like sales, customer service, field service. They all comes with the dashboard that are required to show the valid information to the end users. You can always choose to customize dashboard or create a system or a personal dashboard. Moving on, we are going to talk about business rule. So business rule is a great way to implement a low code, no code platform with a minimum custom code. Business rule allows customizers to build client-side logic, and that also takes the need of creating custom JavaScript. For example, you need to show height a field on a particular form depending on certain condition. You can create a business rule instead of creating JavaScript for that particular job. So business rule is applied either to a specific form, depending on what you are choosing, or it can be applied to all different forms that are available against that entity. It can be triggered when a record is open or when a field is changed, which you are mentioning. So you can always mention a different trigger point for that business rule. Now, let's talk a little bit around the scope of the business rule. So when you are defining a business rule, if you are creating a Canvas app, which is a Power App, or you are creating a model-driven app, which is again inside Dynamics 365, um, the business rule that you are creating against that entity is used in all these different type of app, either Power App or either Canvas app or a model-driven app. But just to remember, not all business rule actions are available on Canvas app at this time. Some of the actions that are available on the Canvas app as well as model-driven app are set field values, clear field value, set field requirement level, show or hide field, enable or disable field, validate data and show error messages, create business recommendation based on business intelligence. Some of the actions that are not available on Canvas apps: show or hide fields, enable or disable fields, create business recommendations based on business intelligence. The business rule also allows you to take a snapshot of everything. You can create a snapshot on the business rule action bar. This is very helpful feature in a scenarios where you are developing a business rule and you want it to be shared and get recommendation from your team member. Business rule also provides a mini map to navigate quickly on different part of the process. This is very useful when you are building a very complicated business process with a lot of component. So these are some of the conditions that's available, some of the operator that's available on the business process, like equals, doesn't equals, or contains data. And again, there are ways to compare field to another field of the same type or a selected value or a mathematical formula if your field is a type of numeric or date time field. Couple of key points to remember. If you have multiple different languages provisioned in your organization, you will probably look to localize your error messages depending on all those languages. So each time you set a message, a level is generated by the system. And if you export the translation in your organization, you can add localized version of your messages so that when you import those level back to your organization, the people using those particular language will be able to get the error messages on the defined format that you are using. So these are some of the action and the field to act on, like set default value, add recommendations, show error messages, set field value, set business required, set visibility, lock or unlock field. So this is again a business rule, and you can see here it is what you see, what you get kind of an interface. So when you are creating a business rule, you can add different condition, you can add action, depending on those conditions, what needs to happen. This is the mini map. Which shows you what part of the business rule you are in, and again, this is a representation of the exact code that's been created on the editor. It also allows you to validate. So when you are creating a business rule, unless you validate, you cannot basically publish that business rule. So by means of validate, the platform also ensure whatever condition or action you had provided, they are valid. So we are at the last section of our presentation, and we will be talking about some of the best practices when you are customizing your platform. So avoid option set attributes in quick find. This is to have a better performance on the platform. If you have to use option set parameter, rather have an expectation set with your end user that this might impact the performance of the quick find. When you are starting your customization, always look for the announcement, deprecation announcement on the Power Platform roadmap website. The link is provided here. So this is to ensure that whatever deprecation announcement is being made, you are actually already aware of those, and based on that, you are developing your customizations. For example, XRM .form is deprecated, so it is always recommended not to use that when you are developing or when you are building a new platform. Reduce the form load JavaScript for better form load experience. So if you have a lot of JavaScript on the form onload, which are synchronous JavaScript, your platform performance will be, or form load performance will be slower. Um, Keep the number of fields on the form to minimal, or whatever fields are absolutely required, only bring those fields or control in the form. And when that also make sure that whenever you put those fields on the form and designing those fields on the form, put whatever is more important at the top. This is from a accessibility standpoint. When your users are accessing the forms, that will make their when they are entering a lot of or creating a lot of record, that will make their journey much smoother and experience much simpler. Keep the number of controls on the command bar or ribbon to a minimal. This is again depending very much depends and on the performance. So if you have a lot of control in the command bar of the ribbon, the performance of the form will definitely be slower. Use collapse tabs to defer loading of any resources that takes a lot of time. One good recommendation is use multiple different tab and in your form, and whatever information are actually required on the form when the user log in, only put those field information on the form and on the first tab, and then subsequently move the other field information on the related tab. The reason behind the tabs are loaded asynchronously, so your form performance will be much faster. Similarly, if you have a web resource or an iframe, maybe put it on a different tab so that it doesn't impact the performance on your form load. Configure before customize. That's one of the very key fundamental aspect of customizing any SaaS platform. Always look for a configuration option before doing customization. A good example can be you need to modify or create a show hide rule in a form that can be done through configuration using a business process flow, or you can even do customization by writing additional JavaScript or scripting on the form load to do that job. So always look for a way to configure to to be compliant with the platform releases as well as upcoming roadmap items. Avoid direct DOM object manipulation. So if you an example can be document.getElement by ID, and you are putting some of the element to capture that ID, and based on that you are performing some action on your custom script. There can be scenarios where those ID that you are retrieving by document.getElement by ID is changed with the upcoming release of the platform. So when it is changed, your custom script will fail, and without any notice, your user will have difficulties executing the forms or those custom script. So it is always recommended that do not do any DOM object manipulation. With that, thank you for attending the Tech Talk, and you have a great time ahead. Thank you.